Итак, мы продолжаем. Наш следующий докладчик — это Патрик Стюарт, очень известный Agile Coach. Прошу тебя, Патрик.
Thank you. So, what I'm going to talk about is, maybe I'll wait a little bit for people to come in. Okay, so what I want to talk about is Kanban in the context of innovation and change. So before starting the presentation, I just want to ask a question, just to see if you're awake. So who is working in a company where innovation is not relevant? Okay. Yeah. So from what I see, most of the companies' innovation is really relevant. Now, who's working in your work? Are you directly involved in innovation? Okay, quite a few. Okay. So large part of the talk is about how to use Kanban in order to make innovation part of the daily work. Okay. Now, before diving into innovation, I first want to make an analogy with improvement and how improvement needs to be part of the daily work. So, it seems to be stuck.
Could it be that focus is on?
Okay, perfect. So I'm a lean agile coach, and so one thing I often encounter with customers is that the way they look upon improvement is something like you see on the slide. They see improvement or introducing a new approach as something very exceptional, and so they see the improvement as something outside of the daily work. So they think about improvement as something you do once every few years, and then it's a big batch of improvement. Is that very lean, or is that not so lean? So it's not so lean, right? Often it doesn't show respect for the people. People are not involved, so that's not very respectful for people. It clearly disrupts the flow of work. And yeah, it is not continuous improvement, right? So improvement is something outside of the daily work in this type of organizations. Now, a lean way of doing this is making improvement part of the daily work. Right. So not only is this lean, it does show respect for people. It is improvement in the flow of work, so it respects the flow. It is continuous improvement, but most importantly, it shows a commitment from the organization towards improvement. And not only that, not only does the improvement help to develop the capabilities of a better delivery, but it also helps to develop the capabilities for dealing with change, because change is part of the daily activity, so change is a normal thing to do. Okay. Now that is improvement. Okay. So what about innovation? Oops. Okay, so what about innovation? Okay, so is this lean? When we think about, we do our normal daily work, and then once in a while we think about innovation, and innovation is not part of the flow of the work. It's something separate out of the work. Yeah? This is something you also see very often. We think about innovation as something separate from the actual work. Now the question here typically is much more difficult, because people often see doing the daily work and doing innovation as as two very different things, because the modus of operation for doing the daily work and the modus of operation for doing innovation often is very different. And so we tend to think about innovation as something separate. Yeah. Now, from a lean perspective, from a lean perspective, you would want to have innovation really as part of the daily work. Yeah? And in a similar style that we talked about improvement as part of the daily work, doing that shows commitment to innovation, shows that innovation is part of the DNA of your organization. Okay? Now, in terms of having improvement as part of the daily work, we all tend to agree that that is the way to go. If we talk about innovation, this is often more difficult, exactly because we think that innovation is very much different from doing your daily work. Okay. Now, the conjecture or the assumption that we're making here is that, to a certain extent, there is a value in having innovation to be separate from the work. But on the other hand, we need to pay attention to having innovation as part of the work also. Yeah? So that's what we're going to explore. And more importantly, what we're going to explore is how Kanban can be used to develop the capabilities to have innovation as part of the daily work. Okay, so I'm going to start with like the motherhood story of innovation, the invention of the Post-it note. Okay, who's familiar with the story of the Post-it note, right? So most of the people know this story in terms of there was a researcher at 3M, and so somehow, by accident, he stumbled upon a glue that is not very sticky, a glue that doesn't really glue. Okay, and then for most people, that's the invention, and then for most people, they make the direct leap to, and poof, there was the Post-it note. Okay, that's how the understanding of most people. There was an accident, and suddenly there was the Post-it note. Okay, similar like with penicillin, Fleming. There was an accident with molds in the bacteria, and then poof, suddenly we had penicillin. Okay. Now, in the case of 3M, the real story is a little bit different. Okay. The person that invented the glue behind Post-it notes, Spence Silver, was actually really experimenting. Yeah? It was not an accident. He was deliberately experimenting with different types of mixes of glues. Yeah? And this was a deliberate experiment, and he was looking for a stronger glue, yeah? But it was a deliberate experiment, varying the amounts of ingredients. Yeah? And what he found was a glue that doesn't stick. Okay? Now, you can call that an accident. For Spence Silver, it really was a deliberate searching for a deliberate experiment. Now, very typical for inventors is when he saw this glue, he was really amazed by the structure of the glue. While he understood that this was a glue that didn't stick, he found the characteristics of the glue, he found those exciting. Yeah, for some reason. So he had a hunch. He had a hunch that this type of glue could be used for applications that he didn't know about. Okay? So the invention of the glue itself was only the starting point. It was the starting point, and at that point, Spence Silver still had to overcome a lot of obstacles in order to come to a Post-it note. Actually, it would take 12 years before there was really a Post-it note. What happened during those 12 years? Well, first of all, Spence Silver needed to overcome resistance to resistance from within the organization. You can imagine, even when 3M has a very strong culture of innovation, you can imagine that in a company with a motto, we make glues that stick, if you come up with a glue that doesn't glue, yeah, people tend to ignore it at best. Yeah. At worst, they will resist it. They will say, you're wasting your time. This is not something we can produce. So it doesn't fit into our worldview. The way Spencer coped with that, he was very committed to making this a success. So the way he coped with that is by looking for collaborators, yeah? By building a network of collaborators and trying to find people that could come up with applications for the glue. So one of those collaborators he worked with came up with the idea of having a bulletin board, like a whiteboard, and then put the glue on the bulletin board and then have papers, being able to stick papers on the bulletin board and tear them off again. Now, that wasn't really a success. So it was not, the reception was not very warm. Okay. So he started looking for other applications, and then at a certain point in time, he encountered a guy that is called Art Fry. And Art Fry made the observation that in church, he had his Bible, and he had all kinds of notes in his Bible, and those notes fell out of his Bible. Yeah. So he had this luminous idea that maybe we can stick that glue to those papers, and then those papers will stick in, stay in my Bible. Okay, and from that time on, they started to have a commitment within the organization, and so that was really the birth of the Post-it note. Okay, now remember the time between the invention, finding the glue that doesn't stick, having a solution and looking for a problem, yeah, and then the actual problem-solution fit, the actual commercialization of the Post-it note was 12 years. Okay. So what this story illustrates is both the perspective of the inventor, of the entrepreneur, yeah, as well as the perspective of the organization. Okay. So let's start with the perspective of the entrepreneur, the perspective of Spence Silver in this case. Okay. So his perspective is that at a certain point in time, he has this insight. He does an experiment. He takes something out of a context and places it into another context. He has a hunch, yeah, and that hunch leads to a solution where he doesn't have a problem for yet. Yeah, that's only the invention part. So that's not the complete innovation. The hard work starts then. And that hard work is the hard work of finding collaborators, exploring different options for applications. In this case, the bulletin board, and then later on the sticky notes. Yeah, and then also being very open. While Spence Silver was very committed to making this a success, he was also very open to different suggestions for different types of applications. So he transformed this idea depending on the collaborators that he was working with. Because of this, because of him looking for collaborators, and because of him being able to transform his idea, what he was looking for was commitment from different collaborators to actually support his enterprise, this new product. Okay, if the entrepreneur is successful with that, then he gets a commitment in the organization, and then there's mobilization in the organization where the product is maybe brought to market. Okay. In the case of the Post-it note, commitment, for example, was found by distributing Post-it notes, early Post-it notes, to the entire management team to get commitment from the entire management team to have them use the Post-it note and get them excited about it. Okay, but that's really the final stage. So that's the perspective of the entrepreneur. Okay. Now, this is really the creation process. So what is the perspective of the organization? So while the perspective of the entrepreneur is that of a path creation, creating a new path, the perspective of the organization is one of path dependence. Typically, the organization in its early stages is facing a number of problems, and typically in the early stages, in the startup phase of the organization, organizations do tend to look for a variety of problems and a variety of solutions, a broad variety. They're very open to finding problems and to evaluate different types of solutions. But as the organization is maturing, they go from this pre-formation phase where they work on hunches, they go into a formation phase where the exploration space, the space of the problems and the solutions is narrowed down. They start committing to certain problems. In the case of 3M, they are starting to commit to glue that sticks. And it's that commitment that prevents them to think about glue that doesn't stick. Okay? So as the organization matures, there's a certain lock-in to a certain problem-solution fit, okay? To a certain set of applications with a certain set of products. This is called path dependence. The decisions that were made in the past really influence the type of decisions that the organization is making today, even if the context has changed. Okay? So in the case of 3M, in terms of glue that sticks, and then there's a new idea, and it's hard to imagine that idea within the context of the organization. So what this story illustrates is, in terms of innovation, the contradiction that the organization needs to work with. So there's a strong contradiction between, on the one hand, commitment. An excellent organization requires a high level of commitment, not only commitment to execution, but also a high level commitment to a certain strategy. Okay? Glue that sticks, right? But on the other hand, that commitment actually puts blinder on the organization to cope with a changing environment, to cope with uncertainty. Okay? That's very similar to the type of dilemma that David was talking about in terms of effectiveness, predictability versus being able to change and adapt. Okay? Now, the entrepreneur, in this case, does give us some clue about how we can cope with that type of contradiction. Right? How we can cope with that contradiction between, on the one hand, having a very high commitment, on the other hand, being able to cope with uncertainty and change. Now, in the case of Spencer Silver was very committed, but he was not committing to the whole solution or the whole problem. What he did was, he did a process of incremental commitment. So he was evaluating different options and only committing to a certain option when that option proved to be successful. Okay? So options thinking is one way of coping with that contradiction between commitment and uncertainty. So this is an example of the type of capabilities that organizations need to develop to support innovation, to cope with the contradiction between commitment and uncertainty. This is not capabilities in terms of being able to deliver, but what is called dynamic capabilities, capable to be able to cope with change and uncertainty. So options thinking is one, and especially in a context of innovation, having not just an option, but having a pipeline of options. If we take the example of 3M, remember that the time between invention and the actual commercialization, was 12 years, then you don't wait for an invention at the time, up until the moment when you need it, right? If your market changes every 3 years and your lead time for going from an invention to commercialization is 12 years, then you better have a pipeline of options ready in your organization. You better have an inventory or a portfolio of options ready to deal with the change. Okay, so one dynamic capability, one capability is a capability to ensure sufficient options ready in your pipeline. Obviously, another capability is the capability to make quick decisions, especially in a very volatile environment. To learn fast, you will not always have the options available, so you need to learn fast and make fast decisions. And then finally, the attention to weak signals. In an environment that is changing rapidly, we all know about the stories of Nokia and Blockbuster and what have you, that they saw the signals, or maybe they didn't see the signals of change in their market. If they saw it, surely their reaction to those signals was not appropriate. But not only, in the examples of Nokia and Kodak and Blockbuster are examples of signals external, but also the story of Spence Silver, being able to detect any what I call ugly babies in your organization. A glue that doesn't stick surely is an ugly baby in your organization. Being able to detect those ugly babies in your organization as a weak signal, and then being able to cope, to treat them in the appropriate manner is really one of the capabilities that is needed to cope with that contradiction between commitment and uncertainty, to have a culture of innovation in the organization. So Kanban. So Discovery Kanban is actually an aggregation of different Kanban systems that support innovation and specifically that help you to develop the capabilities to overcome the contradiction between commitment and uncertainty. Okay. Now, Discovery Kanban, in our opinion, contains the critical elements that are needed to have continuous innovation in the organization. On the one hand, there's an element of delivery. If you want to integrate innovation in your day-to-day work, then surely delivery is part of it. There's an element of learning, and there's also an element of growth. And I'll cover those three elements in the next couple of slides. So delivery, I think as David mentioned, we're talking about not just the development part of, if we're talking about knowledge work, we're not only talking about the development part. We're talking about both the inbound and then the outbound part. So we need to look at the entire end-to-end value stream, not just one part of the value stream, the entire value stream. Okay. Now, if I take the analogy with manufacturing, the inbound part is parts coming into the organization, tires and stuff like that. Parts, the inbound part of parts, and then the outbound part is the actual assembly and the creation of the manufacturing of the cars. Okay. Now, we're not talking about parts and cars here. We're not talking about manufacturing. We're talking about knowledge work. So the inbound part is about understanding needs and capturing opportunities, and turning them into options that are ready to be committed. So the inbound part is really about understanding needs and capturing opportunities. The outbound part is about turning those commitments into actual results. So committing and meeting those commitments and turning it into actual results. So that's an end-to-end value stream. So the Kanban systems that support that end-to-end value stream, the upstream Kanban, the downstream Kanban. The downstream Kanban is something that most people are familiar with. That's your typical development Kanban. The upstream Kanban is the part of identifying the needs and capturing the opportunities. Really illustrates well this capability, how you can support or develop that capability of ensuring sufficient options. If we look at the downstream part, on the right, on your right, it's all about limiting the work in progress to ensure sufficient flow in your work. So it's all about making sure that there's no overburdening in your organization. Okay. Now, if I look at the left side is all about, the upstream side is all about making sure that at all times you have sufficient options available for your downstream. Okay. At all times, you make sure that you feed the downstream process so that it can continue to work. Okay. So while the downstream part is really about making sure that you don't have overburdening, limiting your WIP, the upstream part is all about ensuring sufficient options, having minimum limits on the number of options that you have ready, and making sure that the downstream is not starving, is not deprived from work. So that the downstream part always has sufficient options to choose from. Even in the phase where you have a downstream team where the team has different specialities, the upstream part, the upstream Kanban needs to ensure that you have sufficient options for all the different specialities in your team. Now this is a logistics process, and based on what you see in logistics, we can actually do some calculation in terms of if you look at the inventory in the middle, the inventory that we need to make sure that the downstream is never starved from work, we can calculate based on the throughput in the downstream, the lead time in the upstream, we can calculate how much inventory that we need. So we can calculate our minimum limits. So in the downstream part, we're very much concerned about items that are blocked. In the upstream part, in the upstream Kanban, we're very much concerned with items that are stalled. Making sure that items are not stalled, because items that are stalled in the upstream will lead to a lack of options for your downstream. Okay, so it really shows very well how you develop the capability to make sure that you ensure sufficient options in your work. Now, in knowledge work, there's not only the value stream, it's a knowledge discovery process. It's not just a value stream, even if it's an end-to-end value stream. There's also an information flow. Okay, information flow is typically we make assumptions. If I look at the workflow that implements my value stream, I make assumptions in the beginning of the workflow, and then at the end, these assumptions may turn out to be false assumptions. So we have feedback loops. Okay, we make an assumption about the desirability of a certain feature, and then it turns out that that feature is not desirable. So we get a feedback. Or we may make an assumption about the feasibility of a certain development, and it turns out that it's not feasible. We make an assumption about a certain technology improving our performance, and it doesn't improve the performance of the system. So we get feedback loops and feed-forward loops. Now, in terms of learning, those feedback loops and those feed-forward loops are the critical parts of learning. We don't always know up front what the desirability of or the viability is of a certain solution. Yeah. So we can have vicious feedback circles. We have a quality problem leading to more quality problems, or we can have virtuous feedback loops. We have customers that are committing to our solution, and by committing them, they give us resources, and it gives us more resources to develop more nice features for our customers. So the feedback loops are really need to be supported by learning and decision-making loops. I tend to look at these in a very generic sense as the decision-making loops in terms of the observe, orient, decide, act loop. So making observations about what is happening, making sense of those observations, making decisions, and then acting to those decisions, and then on the other hand, forming hypotheses about either your process or forming hypotheses about your product, and then doing experiments and then learning from those experiments. So the OODA PDCA loop. So the OODA PDCA loop can support the vicious circles, but you have them support the virtuous circles, of course. They can support your issue management, observing issues, making decisions on issues, then planning countermeasures, doing those countermeasures. But what you actually want is them to support not just issue management, but also support your proactive, your virtuous circles. Making observations about opportunities, deciding about those opportunities, forming hypotheses, and then doing experiments to learn from that. Now again, just like we Kanbanized our value stream, we can also Kanbanize these learning and decision-making processes. Okay. Now the purpose of doing that is actually to come to fast decision, to develop the capability of fast decision-making and fast learning loops. So the Kanbanization, it's always, yeah. So the Kanbanization here, the Kanban systems that support it are essentially a Kanbanization of the OODA process, the observe, orient, decide, act process, and the plan, do, check, act process. So the observation part is all about observing and deciding. So what you have on the board there are observations that may lead to certain hypotheses, and then we have experiments that we will use to validate those hypotheses. Okay, so concretely, this might be observations about our product, about users, how users are using our product. We can have a hypothesis in terms of believing that a certain feature will increase our user base, and then maybe doing a small experiment to see whether that hypothesis is a valid hypothesis. Okay. Now, this is not just a visualization; it is a Kanban system. Yeah. So, limiting the number of decisions in progress, is crucial to come to fast decision cycles. Developing the fast decision cycles is all about not limiting work, but limiting your decisions in process. If you have many decisions in process, probably your decision cycles are very slow. If you have few decisions in process, your decision cycles will be fast decision cycles. Okay? Same goes for your experimentation. If you have fast learning loops are supported by having a limited numbers of experiments in progress. So the same applies. So it's developing that capability of fast decision and learning cycles. Now, in innovation, in volatile and changing markets or environments, often your organized feedback loops, your organized decision and learning loops do not capture everything. Yeah? So we talked about the Nokia and the Blockbuster. These are the obstacle that these organizations had was that there were signals in the market that were not captured by their ordinary feedback loops. So this is what we call weak signals. So one form of weak signals is the famous invisible gorillas. So these are big threats or big opportunities, and they might be visible or invisible to your organization. Yeah? But surely you don't have an appropriate response to them. Yeah? So your response to them is not appropriate. Okay? Now that's from an outside-in perspective, coming from the outside world to in your organization. But there's also weak signals in your organization. Yeah? So this is what we call the ugly babies. Yeah? The ugly babies are like the glue that doesn't stick. Yeah? It's a new development in your organization, but for which the value or the appropriateness is not clearly evident. Yeah? So the glue that doesn't stick is a good example. Here's a quote from Pixar, the Pixar president. Every movie that they make is starting out as a very ugly baby. Yeah? It's not that the one that is pitching the movie and then the organization is saying directly, this is going to be a hit. No, typically it starts out as something that is really bad. But the response of Pixar is the appropriate response in terms of not killing that ugly baby, but nurturing that ugly baby. So the capability in terms of dealing with those weak signals is not just identifying those weak signals, but also having an appropriate response to them. Yeah? In the case of ugly babies, having the appropriate response of not making those ugly babies go through the normal ROE type of selection process, but actually nurturing them at the moment that they need nurturing the most. Okay, so in terms of the process, these are the two processes that we demonstrated with the 3M story. So from the organization's perspective, it's all about you have problems, you want to find solutions to those problems, and then have a commitment to that. Okay, so that's the bottom part there. Yeah? But what is most often neglected is also the top part. We have solutions in our organization, but they're not recognized. They're not nurtured. Okay? So it's all about finding out what are the solutions that are looking for a problem, and then trying to find the fitting problem, and then getting a commitment to that, finding a problem solution fit. So again, we can visualize that, and so this is more type of a visualization. It's not really a Kanban board. It's kind of a visualization of the portfolio of growth options that you have. Yeah? So the portfolio of growth options in terms of, on the one hand, what are problems or opportunities that we have that are looking for a solution, the bottom part, and how that is involvement into a lock-in. But more importantly, the portfolio of solutions that we have that are looking for an opportunity, that are looking for the problem that needs to be solved. Okay. Okay. Yeah. So combined together, this is a visualization. This is, to our opinion, actually a visualization of innovation in your organization. On the one hand, it's a visualization in terms of, at the bottom left, all the inbound needs and opportunities Outbound, what are we delivering to our customers? On the top, how are we learning? What observations are we making? What hypotheses do we have about our customers, about our process? And how are we validating those hypotheses? And in the middle part, what is the portfolio of growth options that we have that support our innovation? Now, the visualization is useful in terms of creating collaboration around innovation. It's useful as a way to reflect on how you're doing in terms of continuous innovation in your organization. We've done a couple of sessions around this, and then if you see only tickets, post-it notes on the bottom part, and you don't see any post-it notes on the top part, that already says a lot about the status of innovation in that organization. Now, that's the visualization part, but in the end, I want to stress that it's not just visualization. It's more than just stickies on a board. These are all individual Kanban systems. And the reason why these are all individual Kanban systems is that it is about developing capabilities in your organization. Yeah? Not about developing capabilities to deliver. Yeah? This is only one part of it, the outbound part of it, but also about developing capabilities to change and to innovate and to develop the capabilities to deal with commitment versus uncertainty. So it's all individual Kanban boards, decision-making, fast decision cycles, learning, fast learning cycles by limiting the number of experiments in progress, and then the inbound part about ensuring sufficient options. So, summarizing. So we talked about the dilemma, the contradiction that organizations are faced with when they want to embed innovation in the organization. And that dilemma is, on the one hand, we need a strong commitment to be excellent. Okay, we want especially a strong commitment in the execution. On the other hand, we need to deal with that uncertainty. And often the commitment is really a blinder to uncertainty. Even worse, strategic commitment can be actually, if that commitment is too early, and if it's the wrong type of commitment, it can actually lead to failure in the organization. So, dealing with that commitment versus uncertainty paradox requires a set of capabilities, and not capabilities to deliver, but capabilities to be flexible, to have organizational flexibility. We call that dynamic capabilities. And then Discovery Kanban, and as an aggregate of different Kanban systems, is a way of developing those capabilities. Just like Kanban is a way of developing the capability to deliver and to cope with the demand. So, in our view, this is lean. So, in our view, it is appropriate to think about embedding innovation in the day-to-day work. I do think there is a value sometimes to have innovation outside of your day-to-day work, let's say in an incubator or something. Yeah, but it shows commitment when you to innovation. It shows that if the best way to have to develop innovation as part of your DNA is to actually embed it in the day-to-day work. And then finally, okay, I'm doing something wrong with the clicker. So finally, please reach out. We've got a couple of some material that's supporting this. We've got the Discovery Kanban poster. We're piloting the canvas. So the Discovery Canvas, and so please reach out and if you want to know more about this. Thank you. I don't know where we are in terms of timing.
We have about 15 minutes for the questions. So any questions?
Thanks a lot for your talk. Could you please give us some more examples of weak signals? Maybe from real life.
Yeah. So for a long time, I considered Discovery Kanban as an ugly baby. Yeah. Yeah. So for a long time, I considered Discovery Kanban as an ugly baby. Yeah. For a long time, it was a solution looking for a problem. Okay. So for us, for our organization, this was a weak signal. This was something. It was not clear what the value of it was, but we needed to nurture it to a certain point in time, and we're still nurturing it to a certain point that it's clear what the value is. If we would have Discovery Kanban go to a selection process and try to build a business case for it, we would have killed it, right? So we nurtured the ugly baby. Okay, so that's, I think, the most important weak signals are the ugly babies in the organization, because those tend to be neglected. Now, obviously, you have the gorillas from outside. So for Nokia, it was maybe Apple, right? For Blockbuster, it might have been Netflix, I guess. Yeah. So any changes in the market that were maybe a signal that for the taxi drivers today, it's Uber, right? So there's plenty of examples. Now we most of the time we tend to overemphasize those things that are outside and going inside, but a lot of the weak signals are in the organization. The ugly babies are at least as important as the invisible gorillas. Yeah, but we want white swans, right? So we want our ugly babies or our ugly ducklings to turn into beautiful white swans.
Thank you very much for the talk. I'm trying to put together these 8 elements so that actually, trying to make sense how one pulls work from the previous one. And to be honest, I fail. Can you explain a little bit how each of these sections pulls work from each other?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. So without going into too much detail, so the normal value stream, okay? So this is really about the day-to-day. This is our running business. This is about what we're learning about our running business, okay? And this is about how we can grow. Where do we have a lock-in? Important to know, because that might be an indication of any invisible gorillas that we have, but also where we have options for the future. Okay, so think of this as from the bottom to the top. From the bottom up, it's all about outside in, right? Opportunities that are coming from the outside in our organization. Okay, so the inbound part, opportunities coming from the outside, or needs or requests coming from the outside. So that's an outside-in perspective. Here we have an inside-out perspective, right? These are the observations that we are making. Okay, so we're making observations about our running business. Okay, typically the flows are from left to right. So we have a flow from here to outbound. Okay. We have a flow at the, if you look at the upstream versus downstream, it has the same relationship as observation versus experimentation. Okay? So that's the same type of relationship. Here we get options and we deliver those options. Here we have observations and we try to learn about what we're seeing. Okay? So in general, the flow is from left to right. Okay? Now, obviously, sometimes we have an opportunity coming in from outside. Okay? So if I take the example of my own organization, we have an opportunity coming in from the outside, an organization that really comes in with a very challenging opportunity, not my day-to-day opportunity. Okay? Now, that might flow into an experiment. Okay? So, for example, we have a request for development of a certain feature. Yeah? A feature that we find as very challenging, maybe let's say technologically challenging. Okay? So that goes through my upstream part, but then we feel that we need to, we just can't develop it like that. We need to form a hypothesis around it and do some experimentation around it. Okay? So while the general flow is from left to right, there are cross flows. Similar goes for my observations. Certain observations, if they're repeated, may be an indication of any types of weak signals. Okay? So suppose that I'm observing that I'm losing a certain type of deal on a regular basis. If I take the example of Record Store, Record Store was disrupted by Netflix, I guess. If I take the example of Record Store, there was a regular observation that people were bringing their videos, bringing them back in, returning them just like that, and reclaiming their fee. And that was an indication that people were just copying it. So if you have a regular observation like that, this might be an indication of a weak signal of an invisible gorilla. Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay. So the general flow is from left to right, but sometimes there's cross flows. Other questions?
From my point of view, there is a risk that we can spend a lot of time and resources on working out some idea, some ugly baby, and we will not get a result. So what are your recommendations to find the balance when we should stop and throw the idea away and take another one?
Yeah. So, so one example of an organization, and I'm going to start in the value stream part. One example of an organization is where people are working both in the downstream as well as in the upstream part. Okay. Now, what gets the most attention? Downstream part, delivery, right? Now, what happens if those people are having all their attention to delivery? Yeah, they lose sight of the discovery. Okay. So you will have a gap in your pipeline of options. You will have a serious gap in the pipeline of options. And in the end, what is the result? Yeah? The people that are in the delivery at a certain point in time don't have any work that is prepared for them. Okay? So I make the analogy of hunting. If you wait to hunt until you're hungry, you might have the problem that at a certain point in time you get really hungry because you're not finding any food. Okay, so waiting to hunt until you're hungry is a very risky strategy, right? So you need to hunt while you're not hungry yet. Okay, so that's for the upstream, downstream parts. Now you need to manage your commitment. If you overcommit to an uncertain development, that is the commitment versus uncertainty dilemma that you have right there. So the way of coping with that is doing an incremental commitment strategy. You invest a little bit, yeah, and you invest a little bit not just in one option, you invest a little bit in multiple options, and then you see which options are successful, and then you put in a larger commitment. Yeah? So an incremental commitment strategy is really, really important there. Okay.
Last question, please.
If any. Any more questions? No?
Okay.
Okay, then thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick.